I'm summarising the key points from this book, When the Hood Comes Off, by Rob Eschman. Now, firstly, what is racism? How is it defined? Well, it's an ideology of racial domination or exploitation that firstly incorporates beliefs in a particular race's cultural and/or inherent biological inferiority, and secondly, it uses such beliefs to justify and prescribe inferior treatment for that group. So it's a bad thing, and lots of people will argue and say, well, I'm not racist because I don't see colour. One sees this logic because they say, how can I be therefore racist? But this is actually colourblind racism. You may say, why is that, Chris? And it's because this looks at racial inequality in individual terms rather than racial terms. And it ignores racial inequality that's built up over the years, and it legitimates a racist system and therefore perpetuates inequality. Now, the title of this book comes from the hood, referring to the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, hood being taken off. But racism is ongoing, and it's just in a different way. It's not behind a kind of physical mask. It's written by a black person, Rob Eschman, and he was actually shocked at how prevalent racism was when he started some online gaming with his cousins. And he went on to investigate this for his PhD, performing grounded theory research interviews, mainly on students, and also a bit of quantitative analysis, focusing mainly on Twitter data, now called X. And if you want to follow me on X, here you go. These interviews were assumptions that in a current society, overly racist statements are frowned upon. And they sought to explore how racism occurs online and how it actually impacts students of colour. Now, interestingly, it noted that black feminist groups try to analyse the interconnectedness of white straight men groups who are in the mainstream, and they try and suggest that these groups are frequently Islamophobic, homophobic, and also racist. And online explicit racism appeared actually to becoming more prevalent, and even was often associated with politicians who are in essence just quoting garbage. Now, over time, racism has changed. In the 1930s, people were able to admit racist views, and an example would be with restaurant owners, and they were asked, they were in the USA, would you serve Chinese people? And quite shockingly, the majority said, no, I wouldn't. However, when actually tested and they put Chinese people in, most of them were served. So that's an example of people actually saying they're racist but not being as racist. Now it's shifted to the other way, in which nobody says they're racist but they are. You'll say, how, Chris? Well, an example given in this book is that black people being refused entry to a nightclub. And they would say, well, why can't I get in? Oh, it's because of the shoes you're wearing or the hat. And in essence, you could say, well, having a dress code isn't racist. It is, if it essentially bans things that are associated heavily with certain communities. And it's hard to spot this subtle racism, which you could refer to it as racism with a lowercase r, because when it's with a capital R, it's apparent. And you'll see lots of, well, hopefully you won't see too many. If not, watch my YouTube videos. They're better than hard, extreme racist groups with strong views. But these people almost are a hindrance, because you could say, well, I'm not racist, look at those lunatics, I'm not like them. And there's almost this perception now that people aren't racist until they're actually caught to be racist. So this is this masked racism. And we only have to think about health inequalities and differences in funding, for example, that can occur to often the more deprived groups. So, as I mentioned, Twitter X was studied in this research, and interestingly, lots of people have multiple Twitter accounts. I've only got one. I don't go on it that often, but here it is again. And people would often make up fake names and spread racist information, and there was one notable example in which a white college professor in 2020 actually was posing of an immigrant woman of colour trying to argue against feminist and anti-racist policies and ideas. I think he got caught because he forgot to switch his profile or whatever. And if you're interested in also inequalities facing women, I've summarised this book, Invisible Women, which I think you'd really enjoy and glean some valuable information from. So online chat. This is increasingly hostile, and it isn't always about race. It's because in general, online discussions, you don't see somebody, you get no eye contact between individuals, and the ability to see somebody's face and recognise that they're actually a person means that you're often unkind, displaying decreased levels of empathy for each other. Now, without these non-verbal bits of communication, voice, tone, body language, we can readily misinterpret other people's views. And also, it's more difficult to make our own points come across clearly without being offensive or misinterpreted. Because it is all about the perspective, the lens that we look at something in terms of how we will interpret it. That's not really in this book, but there you go. Now, remember, there is actually a cohort of people who want to preserve the racial status quo and keep racism a secret or under the hood. And by outlawing the ability to look for racism, then you're actually meaning it's hard to investigate, and in essence, it's hard to eradicate. And one could argue that this is one of the legacies of slavery, in that many white people are afraid to talk about race, and they don't want to be associated with it, and therefore they're not going to do anything about it. Now, students of colour who are studied often believe that their white peers operate according to the nice PC rules of racial disclosure. That's in which we wouldn't want to say anything offensive, and therefore maintaining some sort of innocence of racial matters and avoiding deeper conversations. Because there's also a tendency for some white people trying to be trendy to say that they're anti-racist. They'll use terms such as privilege, structural racism, recognizing my own bias to show they're informed. I can genuinely say in real life I've never heard anybody say any of those words other than privilege, but there you go. And you also may hear a term called woke, another one I've never heard, and that's people being awoken and think of themselves as beyond racism. Now, the problem with these terms is that when you throw them in, you think, great, I understand the concepts, job done, and then no more is needed. And often when white students, and they keep talking about students because they are the people who are studied in this book, but when they make assumptions or generalizations about race, they may often just go unquestioned in the classroom. Whereas a student of colour is kind of stuck in a perpetual bind. If they speak up, they could risk offending their peers. And if they remain silent, they may suffer abuse. And the book's got lots of information about Obama being president and being replaced by Trump, suggesting that the US is becoming racist more so. I don't follow politics and don't live in the USA, so I'm not the best person to provide an opinion on this. It also mentioned about this anonymous online campus board, which had overly racist views shared, and there was this incongruence between the friendly post-racist campus and the despicable racist views being posted online. And these hidden racist attitudes sadly do prevail. And there's talk also about some members of the black community being fearful to speak up because they could be dismissed as a stereotypical angry black woman. Again, something I genuinely, before reading this, hadn't heard of. But there you go. It must be a bit about where I'm living or who I speak to. Now, interestingly, this mentioned about a march in a university, one of these kind of protests to stand up against racism. And it was attended by mainly white students. And you'd say, well, why is that? Because they're not really the ones impacted here. And the black students chose to attend classes. Well, it's for a few reasons. One of them is the white students had that nice privilege in which they were not afraid to skive off a few classes, whereas some of the black students were. In addition, for lots of people, racism is a kind of theoretical concept which one or two things maybe outrage them and they go and march, whereas for the students of colour, they've put up with this all of their lives. And it's not invisible racism, so it doesn't call for them to go out and march. And that's an example of white privilege and the invisible machines of racism that run across the internet. And sadly, racism isn't going away, it's actually trending. Unlike this video, I would put a guess. But if you've liked what I've said, check out my other videos and I'll see you next time.